Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies of McGill University, a unit of the Jan P. Lind Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. This is the first event in this year's Research Group on Constitutional Studies lecture series. In the normal course of events, the RGCS lecture series, supported in part by a grant from the Institute for Liberal Studies, invites leading scholars in the social sciences, philosophy, law, and history to come to McGill and present their research in progress on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society in a way that will be broadly accessible to a student audience, including the advanced undergraduates who make up a large portion of RGCS. Today's event is an unusual RGCS lecture in three ways. First, it is the first RGCS lecture that has ever had a respondent. Second, it's the first RGCS lecture whose speaker has ever been from McGill, rather than a scholar invited from elsewhere. And third, and the cause of the differences, is it is the first RGCS lecture to have multiple international partnerships and co-sponsorships. In addition to being an RGCS lecture, this is an event in the year-long series Adam Smith Around the World, sponsored by the University of Glasgow's year-long celebration of the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birth. In that capacity, it is co-sponsored by the University of Glasgow's tercentenary celebration, supported in part by the Templeton Foundation, and in particular the reception, the Scottish-themed reception that will follow, is also co-sponsored by the Scottish Government Office of Canada. Hint, the reception's not haggis. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to introduce representatives from our partner institutions. They will be, in turn, Graham Roy, who is Dean of External Affairs and Deputy Head of College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow, and Leslie Gray, who is Deputy Head of the Scottish Government Office of Canada. Dean Graham Roy holds a PhD in economics from the Adam Smith Business School of the University of Glasgow, and he has a long career in both academia and in direct policy advising, having served as an economic advisor, among others, to the First Minister's Office of Scotland and to the Parliament of Scotland. And he has been one of the major moving forces in the substantial academic celebrations of Adam Smith that have gone on through 2023. There's information about the Adam Smith tercentenary celebrations on one side of the one-pager that you picked up on the way in. Graham Roy.
Well, thanks, Jacob, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here at McGill for this lecture. One of 60 events in 18 countries that we're hosting this year to commemorate the tercentenary of our most famous alumnus, a student, professor and rector of the University of Glasgow. And what we've been trying to do over the year is to have a critical look at Smith's contribution, to debate his ideas, to discuss his legacy in a way that we hope that Adam Smith would value, and that way of science, evidence and critical evaluation. And we're delighted that McGill are a part of that partnership through this year. Obviously, the University of Glasgow and McGill have a long-standing relationship going back to the founding of McGill. But what's particularly delighted from our perspective is that relationship continues today. At an event such as this, we had representatives from McGill at our Adam Smith event in June. I'm delighted too that Jacob is one of our Adam Smith Templeton Foundation Tercentenary Fellows, and will be giving a keynote lecture in London next month, and joining the likes of prestigious scholars such as Emma Rothschild, Deirdre McCloskey and Sir John Kay, and giving a prestigious lecture on the contribution of Adam Smith and his legacy. And I'd like to thank colleagues in McGill for inviting me along to today, and also for hosting this event, and also to the Scottish Government, who are partners, not just event here in Canada, but an event in Brussels, an event in DC later on in this year. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Leslie from the Scottish Government, who will say a few words. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome again to this lecture celebrating the tercentenary of Adam Smith. I'm Leslie Gray, Deputy Head of Scottish Government Office in Canada, and the same way I'd like to thank the University of Glasgow for coming out here, all the way from Glasgow, and also to our hosts, McGill University, for having us here today. This lecture and the series in general is a really great opportunity for us to highlight the ever-growing academic links between Scotland and Canada. And it's really great to see so many students with us here today. And hopefully that will help us with the next engagement with our young diaspora and with people who have a general interest in Scotland. So thank you very much for coming along. And while I have you, I will also plug our next event, which we are preparing for, which is a panel discussion at the McGill Faculty Club on Tuesday the 2nd of November. So please keep an eye out for any registrations. And I look forward to seeing you all there. And I won't talk much longer, and I'll hand back over. Thank you.
I said that the three respects in which today's event were unusual were connected. When the opportunity arose to work with our partners at the University of Glasgow as part of the Adam Smith Round the World series, we didn't think it made sense to bring in a speaker from outside to highlight what reading Adam Smith is like at McGill University. And so for the first time, we are having an RGCS lecture delivered by students and recent students of McGill University and of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies, in order to highlight the excellent scholarship on Adam Smith that is done here and to make that be a part of the ongoing online archive that will exist at the University of Glasgow of the events that have taken place all year. I will introduce in reverse order of the order in which they will speak, our discussant and our lecturer. Our discussant is Shal Marriott. Shal is a student in the master's program in political science here at McGill University. She is a member of the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellowship and this year's holder of the Canada-wide Sansom Scholarship in the History of Ideas. She holds a BA from Carleton College. She has wide-ranging interests in 18th century and 20th century political thought. She's the author of a published article on Michael Oakeshott, a radical for the 21st century. And she will be responding to a lecture given by Ryan Griffiths. Ryan Griffiths is a specialist in the work of Adam Smith. He has presented research from that in conferences around the world. He's the author of a major review essay that appeared in the Journal of Politics, a critical reader of Rousseau and Hume, Adam Smith. He has held teaching appointments at McGill, at Baruch College, at Bishop's University. He is an accomplished teacher across wide parts of political science. He holds a BA from the University of Regina and an MA, and as of quite recently, a PhD in political science from McGill University, which degree was awarded for the outstanding dissertation that shares a name with and from which today's lecture is drawn, Adam Smith's Coarse Clay Political Realism. Please join me in welcoming back to McGill, Ryan Griffiths.
Thank you. It's fantastic to be here. I mean, obviously the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birth, visitors from the University of Glasgow, that's a special flavor to it. Thank you to the visitors from Scotland, especially because I have just recently been to the University of Glasgow, had a wonderful time, and it was thrilling to be at that location, and I'm glad that you could come here and sort of exchange things that way. Thank you to the RGCS community showing up today, having me, although I graduated from McGill. Thank you also to Shal Marriott for agreeing to do this response she's about to do. It's been a lot of fun talking about Adam Smith with you in the run-up to this. I hope we continue talking about Adam Smith in the future. As I say, it's a special moment for me, so like allow me this little indulgence of giving a dedication to Uncle Ken and Auntie Cerise from Regina, Saskatchewan. They'll know why. Also, I want to thank Professor Jacob Levy, my advisor in my master's degree and in my PhD. It was also in his seminar that I first read Adam Smith. And to that point, I had been conscientiously uninterested in Adam Smith. If I had a view about him, it was this. He's for liberty, priority of liberty maybe, and then everything works out. Just a kind of naive view of political theory, so I probably would have said, scoffed, he's not a political theorist. If pressed to say something positive, I probably would have said, well, he's, sure, brilliant on Homo economicus, the choices he makes, the consequence of those choices. But that's good in theory, it's naive about practice, naive especially about human psychology. Now, you don't know better until you know better. And when your professor is Jacob Levy in a seminar on the Scottish Enlightenment, he'll give you every opportunity to know better. Short reading list, huge number of pages. Almost all of Adam Smith, very large portions of David Hume. If you subtract the histories, basically all of Hume. Mandeville, some Adam Ferguson. I had my mind changed when I first read Adam Smith. The first thing I noticed was he does not prioritize liberty and then just everything's okay. In fact, there are a lot of restrictions on liberty. Across his works, especially in Wealth of Nations, I think there's a collection of them. I should have looked this up, 64 of them or something. In Wealth of Nations, a Jacob Viner article about it. So I noticed this, and that leads to one more serious criticism of Adam Smith that I want to confront. So mine's the naive liberty view. It's not really a serious criticism of Smith. He doesn't do that. But a more serious criticism is that he does restrict liberty many times, but that they're ad hoc restrictions. That is, he just sort of seems to say, well, right now we can't have liberty, and he gestures at moderation or something like that. He doesn't kind of fund the restrictions on it by resources in his own theory. That's the kind of, I think, a pretty good criticism of his view, and one that I've sort of quietly confronted in the dissertation, never really said it, and that I want to confront today. It's called Coarse Political Realism, and I'll get to that. Not going to be a ton of political realism. I'm going to get it out of the way. And there's going to be a ton of anti-disestablishmentarianism. I apologize if the sale of political realism was part of the interest. There'll be a little bit, but a lot of anti-disestablishmentarianism. Because I'm going to argue against this claim that Adam Smith prioritized liberty and then had a bunch of ad hoc restrictions on it by looking at what I regard as restrictions on liberty in what I will call Article 3 of Book 5 of Wealth of Nations. Article 3 is just the subsection title, nothing fancy. So I'll refer to it as Article 3. Now, it's actually about religious establishment, Article 3 is. But let's say, that's what it is on the surface, religious establishment. That's what happens when you turn and look at it. I actually believe it's about the proper alignment between persuasion and coercion, which is a kind of a classical theme, which is very abstract terms. And if I told you that and you went and opened it, you wouldn't recognize that. What you'd see is a bunch of discussion of paying the wages of the Scottish clergy. I'd sell you this exciting pitch, it wouldn't bear out in what you read. And I want to explain that. I want to explain why it looks like it does, why I'm claiming this, coercion and persuasion, and why when you go to turn to it, it'll look like a kind of policy paper on wages in a church. So the thesis that I'm pressing back on, though, is going to be confronted this way. I'm going to use this text, and I'm going to say that across Article 3, I'm calling it, there's a consistent normative priority of what I will call stability over time, then justice, and then liberty. That's the priority. So for each argument I present, examples from Article 3, I'm then going to comment on how he's using each of these things to kind of ground his restrictions on liberty. So I'll try to vindicate, each occasion where he restricts liberty as really following from resources he genuinely has in his political theory. So this is just a mention of the three arguments that I identify in Article 3 and a couple of intriguing points about it. Let me just state the arguments. Let's say it together. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. about England. I remember the day I heard that word. This is one of the arguments I think he makes. He makes it in the first 7 paragraphs, if you must know, of Article 3. This argument starts in paragraph 8. The non-establishmentarianism, just to have fun, but non-establishment argument made to America, I claim. And then the third argument is vindicatory establishmentarianism, and this is about Scotland. The intriguing things just here I'll mention quickly. What I'm going to claim here is that Smith actually proposed to use the religious movement of Methodism, was a major force in the 18th century, especially in England, also in America. He used that to maintain peace across Britain, across an approaching civil war that he thought. So he used Methodism to kind of keep the peace. And that's the Alavi thesis, this 1906 thesis. It's a sort of a quaint historical thesis that, well, actually, that's what happened in America. What Adam Smith, so Alavi doesn't claim this. He just says what preserved peace and order in Britain across the era of the French Revolution was the presence of the Methodists. That's the historical claim. I'm saying Smith actually proposed that in this text. And so that's a kind of intriguing thing because you can make it a kind of moral evaluation of using Methodists to preserve order. That's just an intriguing thing. I'm not going to comment on it more. I hope you find it intriguing. Second thing, this is kind of for the Smith scholars. The non-establishmentarianism argument in America. I'm going to speak quickly on this because it's not for everyone. 1759, he writes Theory of Moral Sentiments, TMS, I might say. He promises in a future work to write a work of political theory. 1759, he promises. 1760s, he lectures at the University of Glasgow on jurisprudence. 1776, he publishes Wealth of Nations. And 1790, he's revised substantially TMS, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he says, I still hope to publish a work on political theory, but I think I might die before I finish it. He does, and he burns the manuscript on political theory, and we are told that it's lost to us. But there's a catch. In 1790, he also tells us that he's actually published a portion of the planned work on political theory. This isn't commented on much. We normally say we lost his political theory work. He says book 5 of Wealth of Nations, which is where I'm looking, was a part of the plan of publishing that he had for political theory. So it's not exactly true that we don't have the manuscript on political theory. We have 300 and some pages of it, and it's book 5 of Wealth of Nations, Article 3 is in book 5. That's a kind of, it's a Smith scholar thing to care about that. So if you think that doesn't sound like Adam Smith so far, these 3 arguments, you're in really good company. All of the most eminent Smith scholars disagree with what I'm going to argue. They all claim virtually, and I really mean that about the most eminent, the ones I respect the most. I read it, they say that Smith called for the disestablishment of religion. It's the word they use. Most of the claims say that he called for the disestablishment of religion, and he grounded that claim in religious freedom or freedom in some sense. That's the sort of mainstream view. I don't think that's true. I don't think he grounds his arguments primarily in this section, in freedom, nor does he call for disestablishment. There might be something about toleration. Some people might claim that he disestablished religion to have more toleration. Or because Smith was, so disestablished religion in order to create a free marketplace of religion, because Smith was entranced with how markets work. And he's an example of an early economic imperialist, bringing economic reasoning to religious matters. So some celebrate that, some sort of denigrate that, say that this is a bad thing about Adam Smith. It's him dampening down the kind of importance of politics. All of that, I'm going to say, is wrong. It's not true. Now, I want to pose right away a hurdle to that disestablishment argument, just to kind of get on with things. So here's a hurdle that argument needs to face. In Article 3, near the end of it, he praises the established Church of Scotland. Yes, he does call it an established church. There's some people, there's debate about whether it counts as an established church. He says it counts as an established church. He praises it. And the central thing that he says about it is it's got a grip on the minds of the people. this is the thing he finds, if you sort through it, that's the moment he really says it. The great thing about this church is everyone in Scotland is converted to the Scottish church. That doesn't sound like freedom. That doesn't sound like disestablishment. It's praise of this established church. So here's the response of the disestablishmentarian, disestablishment reading. Well, it's the best of a bad thing. And then, well, he surely just wants it disestablished. He's just praising it. Probably, he knows moderates in the church. That doesn't hold water either, because, I'll say this really bluntly, it's kind of an intricate history. He considers two ways of people in a parish choosing their religious teacher. Two ways. One, you can roughly describe as democratic, sounds like freedom. The other as kind of elitist, appointing, it's called lay patronage. I'm really being rough with the history here. Smith considers it and says lay patronage is better. The elite appointing it is better. This is hurting the disestablishment of religion argument for the purposes of freedom. It's also saying he really considered the way the church is structured. This isn't just tossed off praise. He really claims this about the church. It's sort of an intricate little argument. It's not just a passing thing. So that's just a hurdle, and I wanted to get that argument out of the way. I'll come back to it in a little bit at the end, but notice that what I'm finding there, what I'm claiming there, is that he prioritized, well, something over liberty in that argument. I'll try to say what that is in just a little bit. Now, I said not much realism. Here's the realism bit. So the first thesis is that Smith has this priority of stability over time, of normative priority of stability over time, justice, and liberty. That's the sort of first thesis, and I'm pushing back against the Smith likes liberty and then a bunch of ad hoc restrictions. So that's the thing I'm doing. Second thing is this is sort of a smaller part of it. First, here's the quotation that I took my title from: the coarse clay of which the bulk of mankind are formed cannot be wrought up to such perfection. He's referring to the perfection of perfect virtue. He's describing somebody who's perfectly generous, has their sentiments perfectly attuned to how much generosity they should express, how much friendship they should express, or whatever. He says most people can't accomplish that. We're made of coarse clay. And but that it's okay. Most of us can capably follow the rules of justice, and we can't be held accountable, is the sort of key part of the phrase, or the passage. We can't be held accountable for failing to live up to the top of virtue. We can have failings in virtue attributed to us, but can't be held accountable for it. That is, we're not subject to punishment for not achieving the heights of virtue. Most people can live perfectly just lives, and this is just him making this divide in the text between living up to the rules of justice, but it's a little lower than the heights of virtue. So I kind of play around with this meaning, and I'll give you an example of what I think of as a coarse clay description of an agent. Here it is. Individual agents, he says in this arresting passage in 1790 in Theory of Moral Sentiments, says we have a disposition to admire, I'll say awe, if you want to ask about that, to awe at the powerful people in a way that permits their injustices, in a way that permits their vices. That we do this all the time, it's pervasive among us, and enough of us, enough of the time, as I often say about it. And this is what I'm calling a coarse clay description of an agent. They know what they're doing could be criticized morally. They don't believe that standing in awe of someone who's powerful, that they don't think merits the awe they have at them. They don't think that's morally good, but it still happens to them. So Smith is saying this happens to us all the time. We can't be perfectly virtuous. We're made of coarse clay, but nobody should be held accountable for this kind of fact. It's just a bit of a moral failing. We're weak, and it has really bad, essentially, political effects. I'd love to talk more about this thing, but I want to give you just quick analogies so that you get a sense of what this is. You often hear, I think you used to hear, there's a new one now, but politicians are often described as Teflon. Scandal after scandal, and we say he's Teflon. The scandal doesn't stick to him. But you notice the pervasiveness of that. It seems like every politician's made of Teflon. The idea of Smith's, I think, is not that the politician isn't made of Teflon. There's nothing particular about their charisma or anything. The problem's in us. We forgive the scandals and vices of politicians. That's why this pops up all the time. The new way of saying that is scandal after scandal, now we got them. Ah, well, nevertheless. Right? It's that statement, that kind of idea that the powerful get away with things that I want in your mind. So I'm saying that we have this permissive awe at the powerful. The powerful, what I mean by the powerful, is those people with many means to whatever ends. That's what I mean by powerful. So I do not mean, nor does Smith mean, just the king, just the leader, just a politician. I mean, celebrities have many means to ends, partially because they've got money, partially because people want to be around them, do good things for them. They have means to ends. Lots of different people in the world could have plenty of means to ends, and they'd be called powerful people in this account. So the king and the rebel both get this permissive awe at them. Because you'll be saying to yourself, I don't have permissive awe towards the prime minister. No, me neither. But I do with my celebrities. I do with the people I like. I stand in awe of them. I forgive them their sins. I kind of explain it away. Stuff like motivated reasoning. I'm just gesturing at things you might know about. Now, Smith is careful to say he's in Theory of Moral Sentiments, book on moral philosophy, normative ethics, metaethics. He says it's morally wrong that we do this. We shouldn't. We have awe for people who don't merit it. It's morally wrong. He says, but this is boring. Moralists of all ages have said this. But then he goes on in this section that he adds in 1790, where he completes his political theory, I say. He says, though this is immoral, we must acknowledge that they always receive this awe. So the moralists say, I agree, we shouldn't admire people who don't merit it, but it does happen. We must acknowledge. My claim is that he's saying we, political theorists, must acknowledge this as a fundamental fact. Moral philosophers can pick apart the psychology of it. It's got all kinds of fascinating parts. A lot of the quirks of our psychology that Smith is good at explaining are involved in this. So he reduces this awe at the powerful to a bunch of interesting facts. I think it's ultimately, the very bottom is what he calls a love of system. Explaining that would take me into a lot of detail that is not for this talk. So all I want you to see is that he says it's morally wrong, and of course moral philosophers should care about the reducibility of it and study the psychology and see what can be eliminated. But politically speaking, he seems to say, it's a fundamental fact of politics, and that's what I call it. The fundamental fact of politics is that enough of us, enough of the time, have a disposition to admire the wealthy and the powerful. Wealthy are just people with means to many ends. Powerful people who can command people are people with means to many ends. Now, I'm suggesting that this slots him in under what we now call political realists. And I want to just make that as kind of simple a claim as I can. That is, in articles about political realism, you hear things like, I'm thinking of Jeremy Waldron's, I know it's not, maybe he doesn't say political realism here, but political theory. He refers to Hume's, every man must be supposed a knave, then this counts Hume under that. That's all I mean to be gesturing at with Smith, just this, I'll defend it more, but I just want you to get a sense of, well, he's got a principle that says we fail morally, but we need to take that seriously for politics. When we're doing normative political theory, that fact, that we admire the powerful, isn't an object that we can explain away, that we can moralize about. We accept it and draw our normative political theory in light of that fact. I think that sort of just slots him in under what we call realism today. I'm going to say more about this now, sort of more to say that he's a political realist. So he said, agents are made of coarse clay, and my example is, so we don't live up to our moral demands. We awe at the powerful when we recognize that we shouldn't. I add this, that we're the basic material of politics that a normative political theorist has to confront is coarse and ununiform clay, to continue the thought here. So there are, his fundamental idea of what material we've got, maybe ontology, is individual and collective agents. When you do normative political theory, you need to account for both things. Individual agents are made of coarse clay, don't live up to moral demands. But there are also collective agents. I want to just try to explain this fairly quickly. And this, I'm going to say, explains the concreteness of Smith's realism and actually accounts for some of the concreteness you see in realism. So I'm pulling these quotations from sort of out of context with Smith. But he says, state of nature, there's no such thing existing, so don't worry about it. And I want to tell you why I think he says it could never exist. And it's what I'm going to say grounds his claim that you have to rule in collective agents because they'll always be there. So here's a story, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, just to give 4 names. They desire glory. Hobbes says people desire glory. It's a common sort of thing. People desire glory. Glory derives from comparison with people being above somebody else. It's tied to rank and so on. So imagine that John, Paul, George, and Ringo, they're all subject to this, but they're in the state of nature. None of them have any more glory than anybody else. There isn't much glory around to be had because there's no ranking. But what happens is, and we can imagine John doing something good or bad. I'm hovering over some text in Wealth of Nations now. This isn't just nothing to do with Smith. But let's give him something bad. And he just violently subdues Paul. And maybe Smith says we have a love of domineering. You don't have to buy that. But he just violently subdues Paul. It happens. He takes glory in doing this. And George sees it. George wants glory too, and that's all we're looking at right now. George says, I've got 2 options to get glory, probably others, but let's just say he says 2. One, I can try to attack John and sort of be a hero that way or something, try to get glory that way. It's risky. The thing I'll do is go under John and above Paul. I'll prop up John. Oh my God, what a great thing you've done. Paul was a miserable soul. You're such a wonderful guy. I prop it up. Now I'm second in command. I got access to glory. This isn't the story that Smith tells. Every agent is like this. It's just an example of a thing that he can explain in multiple ways. So you get it, that the George, rather than confronting it, just builds up. The person above him tries to be second in command. At least he's got one person below him, Paul. Now, Ringo's there, and he also wants glory. And let's just suppose all he does is, by imagination, align himself with one or the other of them or both. Just kind of thinks, I'm like them, I'm on their side. The way you might do with sorry to sports analogy, but with a sports team. When they finish in first place, I feel glory, pride, something like that. So that's what Ringo does. He just kind of aligns with them. He thinks like, what they say, I like that. You might try to do some complicated thing where he imagines himself as them. Glory's that way. The point is, glory in this case, there's a ranking. First place, second place, John, George. The glory here, though, is not scarce. And it's not, here's an economic term, simple stuff. It's non-excludable and non-rival. That is, Ringo can just sit there and imagine that he's aligned with them. And John doesn't say, hey, I'm using the glory right now. They both can share it at the same time. That's rival good. It doesn't bother him at all if John knows about it. If he knows about it, he probably thinks, good, this is increasing my glory. I like the feel that people are kind of imagining, aligning themselves with me. Of course, that's what we do at parades. The team that finished in first place doesn't say, get out of here, I need to glory to the fans. They say, whip it up, I want more of this. It's subject to network effects. Now, it's non-excludable to glory, although it's tied to scarce rank and it's comparative. It's non-excludable. John can't stop Ringo from sharing in his glory. It's not a club good. Ringo can just sit there and access it. This is not also, if you see where I'm going, it's not a public goods problem because they all have incentives to glory in this. It doesn't bother them that somebody kind of free rides on their glory. It maybe makes more of it, arguably. So what I'm claiming here is that, and there's psychological mechanisms that Smith really has to explain this, enclosing glory in rank makes it abundant. What we want when we want glory is hierarchy, settle it. The pursuit of glory does not drive us apart like a state of war and Hobbes. It drives us into hierarchies, and we just split like that. Now remember, John could have done something good, and that's basically the example Smith gives in Wealth of Nations, but the same thing could have happened. Now, what I'm saying is that you'll always find the basic agents of normative political theory are going to be individuals who are made of coarse clay, but because of this thing that I just explained, also collective agents. We're going to be found in groups, or if we're not in groups, it immediately happens again. We set up this hierarchy to pursue glory. This is what he tells a famous character of his that he adds in 1790, the man of system. Man of system is let's just call him a political theorist, and he wants to arrange society on his ideal plan of government, maybe make him a political reformer. He's actually going to put this in, not just talk about it. Smith sort of tells him, you act as if all the agents in your mind conform to your plan, full compliance. They all have the same principle of motion, Smith puts it. That's what you believe. But it isn't true because you're not accounting for the fact that there are collective agents. There are groups who have an agency of their own, a principle of motion of their own, he says. You have to account for both of these things, and you're failing to do that. When you fail to do that, you just ignore the existence of provinces, cities, groups, churches, secondary associations. They don't show up on your radar. And you're making, I think, a methodological mistake. Forget the morality of it or the justice of it. You're making you're not understanding how political theory works. You're not working with the right basic material. So what I'm saying here now is, imagine the man of system says, okay, well, individual agents, that's one. Tell me who they are. Are they animals? Animals could be agents. Are they aliens? You say, no, they're human beings. And they work like this. They're coarse clay or whatever. He also asks collective agents, what are they? So he had to be told, no, it's not animals, could be animals. No, it's not aliens, could be. It's human beings. Collective agents, what do you say? You say, the Church of England. You refer to actually existing things. Realism is known for using that term, actually existing. This is why. Collective agents count. You then go, well, who are my collective agents? You don't just invent some abstract thing, just like you didn't with individual agents. You said human beings. With collective agents, you can't just say a collectivity. You say the Church of England, the would-be American state, and the Church of Scotland. That's why when you turn to Article 3, it's about coercion and persuasion. I'm going to explain that in a second. But that's not what you see immediately, because you need to see what the collective agents are that you're going to do normative political theory about. And that's what Smith does, the normative political theory about really existing agents like the Church of England, a great incorporation who operates on its own principle of motion. So, Article 3, paragraphs 1 and 7, okay? In these paragraphs, he does, it's basically a cycle of rise and decline, collapse, but it's cyclical is the important thing, perpetual. You align coercion and persuasion and you get this perpetual rise, decline, collapse. Starts over again. So this is a kind of the central problematic in Article 3, like he sets it out, first paragraph, and you kind of got to solve it. And it structures everything else that he talks about. Now, it doesn't have a triptych, 3 images before it. It ought to, frontispiece. So I've sort of given it one. And what I'm going to do is try to go back and forth between 1776, Smith actually writing this, and actual history, and tell you that he's not just kind of describing something in abstract, he is, but he's also telling an actual history. And that's an important fact. 1736, I'm going to get little things wrong about the engravings. This is William Hogarth. It's called Sleeping Congregation. So at the beginning of this cycle that I'm going to talk about, what happens is, Smith says in paragraph 7, times of religious faction, times of political faction, they happen at the same time. We often have civil wars with religious and political causes, so imagine there is one, essentially, he says. In such a scenario, because people have seen religion and like church and state aligned before, that's what'll settle the war, a new alignment of it. A politician, ambitious politician, looks for a sect that's got a grip on hearts and minds, makes an agreement, let's align to form a new establishment of religion. This is the sort of start of the cycle. The clergy ask the king in return for 2 things. So they're going to deepen his authority, sort of throw garlands on his coercive power. That's what he wants it for. And he can't do anything else in this situation. He can't refuse to establish it because that's what's going on. It's a religious and political controversy. So the clergy ask for 2 things. Kill off my adversaries. That's the first thing. The violence is important. He's referring back to something like the Restoration in England after the Civil Wars. So that's the first thing they ask. And the other thing is they're weary, he says, of humoring the people, of trying to be popular among the people. So guarantee my wages. He calls it independent provision. So give me my wealth, whether it's wages, whether it's something from a tithe, the land holding, independent of whether or not lots of people are coming to church on Sunday. That's what I want. Why? Because my vocation, the thing that I love, is learning and deepening my faith. The thing I don't like is telling the same old sermons that are crowd-pleasing. I don't like those. I'm sick of them. Everybody wants to hear the same, you get the story. This is the second step. Establishment, indolence, Smith calls it, which is actually just pain-free, not just lazy. It comes from the French. So now the clergy is indolent, and that's what this is depicting. 1736, it's called the Sleeping Congregation, Anglican bishop putting everyone to sleep. It's important that it's kind of funny, right? That it's boring, the religion. It matters in the context of trying to get people on your side. 1736, Smith is about to go to University of Glasgow. It's a wonderful university then as now. Francis Hutcheson is there. Smith loves it. But just a little bit before that, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and his brother Charles started a club they called, I think maybe somebody else called it the Holy Club. They would meet daily, pray hourly, and ask each other accountability questions about their holiness. They were very methodical about, you can still go to Methodist accountability meetings where you'll read John Wesley's accountability questions. They were very methodical about how they did it. They were called Methodists. The insult became the name. 1738, Wesley has an evangelical new birth. His heart is strangely warm. This is the site of accusations of being an enthusiast, which is a pretended inspiration of God in you. Wesley says, I'm not an enthusiast. I want you to tolerate my religion. He's canny about this. He's perfectly sincere. I'm not claiming anything like that. But he knows that being tolerated by the church is the game. He's an ordained Anglican priest, and he always conceives of Methodism as an internal movement to the church. It only separates after he dies, and Smith dies 1790s. Wesley is lecturing to, they say, 20,000 people in London at around 1740, which is when Smith goes to Balliol College, Oxford, and finds it dreary. It's the teachers there, he says later on, you might have heard, nothing compared to Glasgow. They've given up even the pretense of teaching. Why? On the same grounds. They have their wages, they have tenure. They have their wages guaranteed, they don't care about teaching, they want their research, right? It's a kind of sharp thing. He's a professor at Glasgow, and he's recalling his earlier days. He might have heard that first said by John Wesley. 1744, St. Bartholomew's Day, Wesley holds this big sermon where he breaks from the Oxford Forever. Has it published, it's a huge event. William Blackstone comments on it, people know about it everywhere. Smith, I can place him in Oxford the month before. He sends a letter to his mom saying he should have written oftener. He then is in the Wesley holds what's called a university sermon. All the colleges come together, and it's at St. Mary's Church. And so it probably would have had, I'm saying Smith was probably there. If he wasn't, he definitely knew about it. This is what Wesley does. Pulpit right is where the high churchmen, teachers from Oxford are. The clergy that's become indolent, roughly speaking, or the trainers of those people. He says, you respected teachers, are you filled with the Spirit that your office so absolutely requires? Pulpit left, the students, what shall we say of the young people of this place? Don't read, don't pray, they drink too much. That's what he says. Smith is eating this up because that's what he's sending letters back saying. He's got, apparently, Hume's treatise stashed in his room, some say. So you can imagine this dominant figure of the era, 20,000 people, evangelical new birth, traveled to America and back, different Methodists. The Cambuslang Walk that's in Glasgow, I think it's George Whitefield there, Methodist stuff, all over the news. Smith owns a book on the Cambuslang Walk. He knew everything about Methodism, and he might have seen John Wesley in person say this about the church. So notice that Wesley's saying now to the high churchmen, he's saying, by whom shall this Christianity be restored? They've let it wane, just like the sleeping congregation. By those of you that are in authority, can't be, you're lazy. But suppose ye have this desire of reviving the faith. You don't have any power, portion to the effect. You've tried a few faint attempts, It'll be restored by young inconsiderable men. I know not whether ye yourselves could suffer it. Sticking it in their face. Inconsiderable men, Wesley, they had lay preachers. Wesley was an ordained Anglican priest, but lots of the Methodists were just people getting up and telling the faith. So what you notice here is that Wesley says Christianity needs to be restored, which is what Wesley thought his movement was, a revivalist movement. Those of you who are in authority, you're lazy, corrupt. And he's talking about the Methodists, and he says, you're going to persecute me. You won't be able to suffer it. And he's kind of bringing it on, because Methodism was in a very charged debate throughout the 18th century. And Wesley obviously knew it. They were accused at the same time, this is such a cool little fact, of being Jacobites and being Cromwellian Puritans. Sort of can't be both things at the same time. The people who write on this say what matters is that those accusations were made. Methodists were seen as politically deeply important to think about. Why Jacobites? 1 year later, 1745, is the Jacobite Rebellion, and Wesley's seeing it coming. He mentions Romish aliens and stuff. Now being called a Jacobite and being a Methodist is a real problem, and there's lots of persecution going on. They're sending it back as good as they get it. So what's happening now is there's a really popular religion. I love that this is a painting by John Griffiths, which is my dad's name, long time ago, 1750. That's George Whitefield, he's a Calvinist wing of the Methodists. Field preaching, just get a general sense of what's going on here. Enthusiasm displayed. They are enthusiasts. Wesley saying, no, we're not. They're giving sort of evangelical new births to people. It's a really exciting religion. The preachers are fiery, anything but boring. And why? Because they know that that's how they're gaining adherence, by depending on the foil of the church. They don't want to disestablish it. Wesley's clear about this throughout his life. I think Whitefield's a little different. Wesley's clear, always the established church. He knows what's up. And again, none of that's saying something insincere or something about Wesley. I just mean he really knows the politics of it. So know that. Next frame is William Hogarth again. I think it's 1762. There's a complicated history of this print. It's the same church. Hogarth revisits it 30 years later. It's crazy. Everything's gone nuts. Why? The church called in the state, the next step, to persecute them. They become much more radical, much more popular. And you see, that's George Whitefield again, one of the major Methodists, and his wig is popped off and he's got a Jesuitical tonsure, the Jacobite sort of claim. It's incredible, the stuff in William Hogarth's prints. It's popular culture written down or drawn out. There's a really fun little fact that when these engravings would go to other countries, they translate it. They put words down of what it's referring to, though there aren't many words on it. So anyway, this is obviously making sort of fun of Methodism in it. And it's hinting, though, like, watch out for these people. They've been persecuted. So what happens in this cycle of it? Religious and political civil war. What solves it? New alignment. Cycle continues. Boring church. Right? So that's the cycle. Smith has to confront it. I know I'm going on time, but now we're starting to go downhill, speeding up through the arguments now. The king's in a quandary, and this is what we're going to revisit. The church call in the state, hey, persecute the people for us. Persecute maybe the Methodists, but it could be any religious upstart. The king worries about this because his coercive force will look pretty bad defending a boring clergy. The flippant words here are kind of important. It's part of the public culture of the day. So can the king just say, disestablish the clergy when they tell him to do this? That would be perfectly ruinous. He doesn't say disestablishment would be violently confronting them, he says. Perfectly ruinous to employ force and violence. Don't do it to an established clergy. That's not an option. He's worried, though, about approaching civil war and just this cycle of violence over and over. Can you just deny their request to persecute? Just say no. No, because they will oblige the people to transfer their allegiance to some more orthodox and obedient prince. You can't do it because they'll flip on you. And they have enough leverage with the people, say, remaining, or the king has to worry about whether they do, that they could flip on them. So the king is stuck. It's a continuous cycle, and Smith is going to address this with this normative priority of values that I'm talking about. Here's the normative priority of stability over time. Smith has just given you, a theoretical account, a built-up understanding of how coercion and persuasion work together. I'm not saying it's incredible, but it's not just an ad hoc, something he hasn't thought of. It recurs in history of feudalism, Catholic Church, even in origins of language. It's all over the place. This is a principle of Smith's, this cycle. So he's thought about it. So prioritizing stability over time over maybe liberty or something else is not something ad hoc. It's something that his theory can fund, sort of. So now the question is, Smith has to figure it out, how to prolong the peaceful phase of the brutal cycle, how to deny the clergy this request. Note now the Scotland thing makes a little more sense. It was just in the peaceful phase of its cycle. Smith's prediction is align coercion and persuasion, and you make each insufferable. Scotland was just in a good situation. That's why the grip of the church over the minds of the people, well, it's worse if they don't have it, and you still have an established church. The established church will call in state to persecute them. Justice, I'll just say this quickly. I love his sort of meta-ethics of this, great stuff. Theory of justice, I'll just basically say, it's the disposition to regard oneself as mutually accountable to all others. So lots to say about that, but the basic thing is that if I'm saying that this is one of his normative priorities, one way to encourage justice, one thing that you'd have to spot in his argument, if I'm right, is support for justice, which I think is related to increasing respect among people. That's just a kind of requirement. It'll help justice actually be manifested. More respect, self-respect. I can support that argument. Liberty, I don't know what he means by liberty. The best article there is on Smith on liberty is from Christopher Barry from the University of Glasgow. You see it there. It's best because he goes, this is really complicated to sort out. He gives us standards for it. I could say some accounts of liberty that I disagree with, but we'll be fine. We don't really need it. So we're back to the king's quandary, right? I realize time is marching down. Paragraph 2, we're on now. Smith is referring to, he uses words like mendicancy, he uses all these different kind of complicated little, slanders on people. It's complicated. But they map on to how people describe Methodists in the time. He mentions Methodists twice in the first paragraph, and he just continues mentioning them. As far as I know, almost no one has noticed this except for maybe Methodist scholars. Then he hits on this idea, the king's quandary. How can we let the king get some wiggle room here? Well, Machiavelli has an idea. Machiavelli explicitly references Machiavelli and says, listen to him, what he says about Saints Francis and Dominic and how they revived the religion in the time. It's Discourses 3:1. Here's the title of it. In order for a republic to have a long life, bring it back to its sources. That's like an ad fontes renewal, popular in the Renaissance. But Smith isn't doing this it's a kind of updated social psychology modern thing. I'm not celebrating the specific thing, but it's not burdened with some other things. It's just an account of what happens when you align coercion and persuasion. But anyway, he refers to Machiavelli, ad fontes renewal, right? What does Machiavelli say in there? Maps on perfectly with what people were saying about the Methodists. St. Francis and Dominic, there's a lovely stuff in here, or, it's Machiavelli. He says, what worked with them is they told people it was evil to speak evil of evil. Now let's put that in John Wesley's terms. You, high churchmen, are corrupt, evil. It's evil to speak evil of them, though. Go to the Anglican Church on Sunday. Keep Methodism as a revivalist movement in the church. Smith knows this and is just saying, this is like what Machiavelli says. This might work. You've got some wiggle room, King. You can maybe deny the church this demand for persecution. Still not done, though, because you don't want to confront them directly. But one thing that you do have on them, so there's still this problem. If you just say, allow the Methodists to live, they might just say no, because I know my Machiavelli, they just say no. But you might have one thing over them, one thing left. Don't confront them. you can manage the preferments they have. You can, he's about to quote David Hume, 500 words of David Hume, you can bribe their indolence. You want them to not call in the church, you tell them the Methodists are just reviving the faith. They don't want to overthrow the thing. They want to stay in the Anglican Church. And then they say, but I don't like it. How about you don't do any more popular preaching and you just study? That's threading the needle. The same idea of, he's mapping this onto the University of Oxford thing, I'm not joking around. Imagine saying to a professor, stop teaching, give it to younger people, and just do research and I'll increase your wages. It's a bit insulting, but it's not something that's unacceptable, right? I'm saying he's threading the needle. It sounds, insulting. He's quoting Hume. Hume's, known as Hume, and so like it sounds insulting. I want you to get the sense also that it's just reasoning this out. The cycle is happening. The clergy could hear this and say, well, I'll take more money and I'll stop doing that, fine. So I'm not saying they would, it's possible, right? So stability over time in this argument, I'm running downhill, I'm going to finish. What does he say? Well, the ad fontes renewal, he refers to Machiavelli, bribe their indolence. So he thinks that prolongs the peaceful period in England. So that's his account. I don't think that's ad hoc. I think it's grounded in what he's saying about cycles. Justice, very quickly, he says, like, when people come into a city, they get sunk in obscurity and darkness. They lose a sense of their character. They can easily be taken advantage of, fall into vice, and so on. But they never emerge so effectually from this obscurity by becoming the member of a small sect. It's Methodism. I swear it is. You have to have a sense for the thoroughness of how Methodism was in the culture. Liberty, well, there's not much about liberty there, except this. Freedom of association, which he doesn't use in the future, is an individual right to join an association. Join an association. It's good for people who are in need of community. The other side of it is a group right, the association to control the members. This is what Wesley was fighting for. For the credit of the sect, I want to kick people out. If they bring down my name, I'll suffer. And I need to defend myself against the encroachments of other things, which is what Smith says stability is. Orders in society need to be able to defend themselves against the attacks from others. The solution for stability here is freedom of association. This is really quick, paragraph 8. But if politics had never called in the aid of religion, what sentence do you hear before that? When politics has called in the aid of religion, bribe their indolence. But if it never has, don't. Don't establish a church. Avoid the cycle altogether. Don't align coercion and persuasion. The only place that looks like this at the time where this could be done, where politics had never called in the aid of religion, 1776. American colonies have some established churches in it, but there's no American state, federation, confederation, that's had an alignment of politics and religion. So it might be possible that they could avoid non-establishment. Remember that he rushes the book, the manuscript copy, into print, 1776, to say this. Don't establish a clergy. This is what has attracted all the attention. This disestablishment argument comes from this. I think it's for freedom and that it dominates the rest. It doesn't. It's specific to context. What he's just told you is, I finished one argument, anti-disestablishmentarianism, but that word is crucial. If politics has never called in the aid of religion, everything's different. There's no cycle, avoid it. So now it's roughly the same account, I won't go over that he's saying is good about this non-establishmentarianism. So, stability, justice, and liberty, I think I can vindicate that he's still using that in that argument. And just recall it's 1776. I'll end with this. Coarse clay, political realism is what I call it. One lesson, I think this is general, is never align persuasion and coercion. One example of this, to try to say what I think some applications, nation state is an alignment of persuasion and coercion. That's a politician I'd like to have a beer with, is an alignment of coercion and persuasion. Never do that sort of thing. The coercive backing undermines their persuasive force and unsettles things. So last thing, he's concerned that we over-obey. That was the sort of thing I began with, coarse clay. Even when we realize it's immoral to do it, we still over-obey. Political theorists, manage do not motivate or justify obedience. Obedience is a problem, not the thing we have to get. Thank you.
So I want to start by thanking Ryan for his presentation and to offer my warmest congratulations to Dr. Griffiths for the successful defense of his dissertation. Now, Ryan has just led us through an exploration of Adam Smith as a political scientist. In his persuasive and original argument, Ryan begins by setting a foundation of Smith's corpus as one which is complete in the theory it sought out to explore regarding political matters, and which stays true to the facts which we encounter in our everyday, ordinary political lives, or the political life of the 18th century, as the case may be. In doing so, Ryan claims that Smith develops an intrinsically realist perspective. And this draws out the deeply descriptive nature of Smith's project, with one Smith scholar noting how he emphasizes matters of fact rather than matters of right. Now, one of the essential facts of politics, which Ryan draws our attention to, is this admiration of the rich and powerful, which can corrupt our moral sentiments. One of the dangers of politics is that it makes us worse people. And this identifies the moral stakes involved in political questions for Smith. There's a substantive connection between our desire to do good and how practical that is in a political world. However, there's an even more pernicious source of our corruption, one which we also find in Smith, is another inevitable fact of politics, is a type of group we encounter, and which will be the subject of my remarks today: factions. Factions as a group within a community are an inevitable part of being inspired by issues which matter to us. They are fundamentally antagonistic in nature, but no wonder they are inevitable. Individuals are drawn to people who share their values, perspective, and priorities. As Smith remarks in the theory of moral sentiments, a philosopher is company to a philosopher only, the member of a club to his own little knot of companions. We want people to understand us, our interests, and who we can relate to without having to make adjustments to our disposition, our conduct, or what we are feeling about a particular topic. We want a concordance of sentiments. The perspective which both this line in the theory of moral sentiments and which Ryan gives us on factions in his talk seems to be the best case scenario. The philosophers are harmlessly debating, discussing, and disagreeing with one another. The Methodists, according to Ryan, in the way they challenge internally the authority of the church, allow for a process of renewal and transformation. Factions serve to move things forward based on the sentiments and affections of the present moment, and actually allow for the continued existence and stability of the institution of which they are a part. This is true both in the ecclesiastical context of the church, but also, one can imagine, parties contending for political power. As I said, though, there's a much darker side to this story, which we also find in Smith's writings, which is absent from the discussion which Ryan has provided us with, and which is found right from Smith's very first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In part 3 of the work, Smith writes in a discussion on duty and the nation that the animosity of hostile factions, whether civil or ecclesiastical, is often still more furious than that of hostile nations, and their conduct towards one another is still more atrocious. If you thought wars between countries could get bad, wars within countries can get even worse. And not only does this make for bad politics, brutal politics even, linger on that word atrocious for a moment, but makes us bad people. Smith goes on to say in the theory of moral sentiments that of all the corruptors of moral sentiments, therefore, faction and fanaticism have always been by far the greatest. The fact that they always have been points to this notion of inevitability. They are a part of the political lives Smith finds himself in, and historically which he can observe. And he does not deny that there are other sources of our corruption. As Ryan has mentioned, the admiration that we give to the rich and powerful can also serve to corrupt our moral sentiments. But this one he draws our attention to as by far the greatest. Although this is found in Smith's work of moral philosophy, following the argument Ryan has just put forward concerning the cohesion of Smith's work in general, they are likewise found in his political theory. Factions and fanaticism, which start out as an innocuous desire for understanding, serve to draw us further apart and create conditions which limit our ability to sympathetically engage with one another. This, I argue, is a more fundamental fact of politics than the admiration we have of the rich and powerful, and the stakes of this become even clearer when we turn to the wealth of nations. Smith begins his discussion of factions in that work by quoting, and Ryan observed this, 4 full paragraphs from Book 3 of Hume's History of England. And it is the passages immediately following and before this section, Article 3 on religious establishment, which is what Ryan has devoted a considerable amount of his time to. It's in these sections of the history where Smith, using Hume's voice, is seen grappling with the question of religious and political authority. And as the last line he quotes from Hume alludes to, that tension might not be as stark as it appears, since, quote, the ecclesiastical establishments prove in the end advantageous to the political interests of society. In fact, the case Ryan gives us claims it's not that stark at all, and the church and state can peacefully coexist where factions are merely a part of their development. This portrays, in my mind, an overly optimistic narrative, though, where diverse perspectives in an institution or society more broadly are something we should always approve of. And it is also clear that there are moral consequences of such groups in our ability to be good, but further, that there is a substantive political problem which they can pose. And for this, I turn our attention to the end of The Wealth of Nations. This is where Smith is considering the case of Great Britain and Ireland. And he writes that one of the strongest arguments for a continued union between the two countries is that it would at least deliver them from those rancorous and virulent factions which are inseparable from small democracies and which have so frequently divided the affections of their people and disturbed the tranquility of their government, in their form so nearly democratical. Here again we hear about this problem of inevitability. If you have a small democracy, you are going to have factions. That's just how it is. There is, however, also a distinctly moral language at play here in Smith's use of the term affection, because Smith tells us in the theory of moral sentiments that affection is, in his words, in reality nothing but habitual sympathy. We spend time together, we get to know one another, we become close. And this is the problem that factions pose for us in separating and dividing that affection. Smith goes on in these passages to talk about the benefit of distance for citizens when they are away from the political capital of a country. And here he writes how this distance serves to render them more indifferent and impartial spectators of the conduct of all. This is one of the rare invocations in The Wealth of Nations of the impartial spectator, another considerable moral term which Smith uses and designs an entire system of moral philosophy around in his first work, and that should point to the gravity of it. And his point here is that if you want to be a good person, get as far away from Parliament as possible. Have your capital where you are nowhere near it. And finally, Smith remarks that in the case of a total separation from Great Britain, those factions would be 10 times more virulent than ever. This draws our attention to the stakes at play here, and just how bad he thinks it could get. This is not just a case of immediate historical or political significance in his own time, but rather contributes more broadly to our understanding of his overall political theory. Although factions may engage in a process of renewal, what about the situations where they don't, and society is left scrambling to hold itself together? So what constitutes a dangerous faction? Here, we can turn to his good friend David Hume, or as Ryan tells us, Hume. And Hume writes in Of the Coalition of Parties that the only dangerous parties, and here I'll use parties and factions interchangeably, are those which entertain opposite views with regards to the essentials of government, the succession of the crown, or the more considerable privileges belonging to several members of the Constitution. The problem for factions seems to be when they undermine the systems of which they are a part. And this relates to the concern which Ryan has rightly identified that Smith has with the stability of institutions over time and of public life more generally. But the stability of those institutions may be undermined by the very groups Ryan associates with the potential for restoration. What is it which makes these factions so persuasive? Part of the puzzle is the effect of party leaders. As the pictures which Ryan has shown us throughout his talk show, leaders can serve as a guiding force for how others engage and interact with one another, both putting them to sleep and causing them to be crazy. We are persuaded by powerful rhetoric, and this is why Smith warns his readers of the poison of enthusiasm and superstition, which is one of the ways party leaders engage in the sentiments of their followers. Factions both are created and thrive during times of public discontent and disorder, and motivate their leaders towards a public spirited system. But even in times of seeming peace and tranquility, people still have cause for complaint, and disagreement never goes away. We are passionate people after all. Ryan is right to say that within Smith there is a tendency to admire the rich and powerful, those who can inspire us with awe, and those who we are inclined to follow. However, there's a much more human explanation for the appeal of faction, and one we also find in Smith. Factions provide a space for people to mutually sympathize with one another, and especially at times of significant stress or disorder, factions serve to promote a heightening of passions, regardless of what the motivations for those passions are. This not only allows for individuals to feel proper and justified and approved of in their unmoderated passions, but able to share in those unmoderated passions with other people. It is factions, which I argue, are the inevitable fact of politics, which corrupts our moral sentiments, undermining institutions, governments, but also our very ability to be virtuous. When they become dangerous, or how they serve to threaten the peace and tranquility of society rather than improve upon it, is a challenge I leave open for discussion. Ryan has drawn our attention to the way that stability is an essential part of Smith's political theory. Factions, I have sought to argue, can clearly serve to undermine that very commitment to stability. What makes factions so appealing, so enduring, is the way they are formed out of our very desire for understanding, one we all know and share in. Smith tells us that we naturally desire not only to be loved, but to be lovely. But where do we find that approval? And how far are we willing to go for it? Thank you.
We will now move into question and answer. Two technical notes to start. First, can you turn the screen to black so as not to interfere with the video? And second, for the people who are asking questions, please turn on the microphone in front of you to ask it and turn it off again when you're done. At Research Group on Constitutional Studies lectures, the first question is reserved for a member of the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellowship. Katrina.
Okay, I guess this does work. I just wanted to say great job to both of you. That was very interesting. I have not had the opportunity to read Smith as much as others, but I'm looking forward to doing that more as part of RGCS, and I'm sure that this discussion and the research will help empower my reading. So my question was, it was briefly, glory was briefly mentioned, and the hierarchies of glories, and I think to both of you, I would then pose the question, especially based on Shell's discussion of factions, what role does the seeking of glory and the hierarchies that form from that play in managing factions? And how do you two think that that might offset the potential for conflict or increase the potential for stability? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. I don't know exactly what to say back. I think one passage I would point to is the Man of System passage, where the idea is that this person has become like a leader of a party and he has some ideas and people really like it and it kind of runs off. They go more extreme than he does. And they almost encourage him to take more glory, take more risks. They fire him up. And Smith says he becomes the dupe of his own party. So it's as if he's got this sense of political parties have this feedback loop with their leaders that just seems like really, again, like Shell's right in stressing the danger of it. When I think about that passage, I sort of support and maybe too light on Smith on faction, and just that example is, it's as if we want them to glory more than they are. This admiration of power, the awe of power. I didn't sort of add like it's as if we want them to have more means of power, partially by our obedience to them, and I don't see a way out of thinking that the pursuit of glory in political parties is peaceful. I could say in a couple of cases, but yeah, I'll leave that aside. But it's very dangerous.
And I'll just quickly note, too, that one might consider glory outside of the political context, and whether that's a concern for Smith, I'm not convinced that it necessarily is. But thinking about the context of which people are engaging in this act of seeking glory, but I agree with Ryan that it becomes especially dangerous in political matters.
The floor is open.
Hi, thank you. So I'm not initiated to the mysteries of Smith hermeneutics, so my apologies if my question seems a little general. But I was intrigued by how we should think about Smith's warning about the dangers of aligning persuasion and coercion in view of the fact that it seems to me in a way inevitable that these two will be aligned in a democratic system. So it seems that persuasion is the way to power in a democracy. And so is theory in tension with the democratic theories, or should we conceptualize it in a different manner? Thank you.
So what I was going to add to the last comment was I think he thinks faction and this glory and stuff is especially dangerous when some line, I think it might be confusing with somebody else, but when there is an alignment of coercion and persuasion, so that your glory depends on something that's being backed by this coercive force of the state. So that's when they're especially dangerous. When that's not happening, they're not as dangerous, and that's what he's on to in the non-establishment argument. There's no alignment there. There's no church that the religious sects are attacking and that could leverage state force against them. That's what I was going to say of, it's not always as dangerous as I left off on the earlier question. So then the response to yours is, I don't want to speak for Smith on democracy, but it's just this idea that, in one picture of the democracy, it changes. The whole point is, okay, there is an alignment of persuasion and coercion, but you vote them out is supposed to be the idea. So they have the coercive force for a while, the ones who, tried to form government, and they have the arm of the state for a while, but that's precisely why it's supposed to be contested, so that, if you lose an election to them, you get them the next time. They're not just backed by this state forever. So it kind of, can lead you to accept losses to your glory. So I don't want to paint an overly, like that Smith had this democratic theory response to it. It's just, I think that's kind of in line with what he's saying in this passage about allowing what the people call a marketplace of religion. He just says it works in Pennsylvania. It's because you can have a lot of factions. It's only dangerous when the state power is aligned with one, and then it can leverage the state to charge it. So it just gave me that idea, but I don't want to leave the impression that Smith has a lot to say about democratic theory.
I'll ask one while people are thinking. What is special about Scotland? You told us what's special about America, which is that it's never had a religious establishment yet, so it can maybe avoid the problems. And you told us a story in which England looks like the standard case. England looks like the cycle that he's describing in general terms, but that we can attribute to one decade after another of the English Civil War and its aftermath. The only hope of stabilizing which looks like this kind of lucky state of affairs, which is that a sort of enthusiastic sect has risen up and not rebelled against the established church. In light of that story, it would seem strange and surprising for there to be an established church that isn't in trouble. What is special about Scotland and the Scottish established church that means that it doesn't fall into the English standard trap?
Yeah, I didn't include this because I didn't think I was arguing against the disestablishmentarians, and this was a kind of low-level defense of the church. I think you're onto that it's actually an important defense of it, but it would come across as a low-level defense. Says the good thing about Scotland or some Presbyterian churches is that they pay their clergy poorly. The wages are low, and the best men go into the universities. And so I kind of think like the most ambitious kind of thing is sent off to the university, and the Scottish churches, it's not the site of a real reward that then becomes the focal point for strong factions. It's one of the kind of, I don't know, it depends how you think of it, but it's minor, or to me it sounds minor what he's saying, but he's just saying that that you get this effect of the churches or the universities in Scotland are outstanding, and it's from this effect. So I think maybe that's a lucky circumstance. Trying to think of other things that would be unique to Scotland about it, but that's the thing that jumps to my mind is that sort of, I think of it as a bit of a low-level defense that wouldn't convince people that he's really defending it.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I am far from being a Smith specialist, but I was wondering about the connection that you could make with regard to the notion of managing. At the end, on one of your slides, you had the different terms and about managing, not really about justifying, and most of that period is also at the beginning of the height of settler colonialism. And Lorenzo Veracini, in a recent book, has written about what he calls the world turned inside out instead of the world turned upside down. Right. So one of the purpose or one of the political ideas associated with settler colonialism is of avoiding the coming crisis, right? Of managing the revolution that seems to be coming by moving elsewhere. So utopia is not here. Utopia is in the displacement. We'll create that world by going elsewhere. And I was wondering whether there is something that you could say on this, on the basis of Smith, or maybe extrapolating beyond in terms of the purpose of whether this is a way of managing that crisis. And you see it in many of the movements of settler colonialism, where it's actually those small religious groups moving elsewhere.
I'm thinking a lot recently about Smith and imperialism, settler colonialism included. And the best maybe I can offer a second thing, but the main thing that I'd say is that part of the cause, he thinks, of imperialism and varieties of it are that we are encouraging the powerful people to use the means that they've got. We want them to have standing armies for we don't care what. We want he's got this line that's like brutal of distraction of war across the way. And we're using the public debt to give people this public entertainment. His description of European imperialism, modern European imperialism, is that it's unjust and that it's caused by this fact in us. And the state, with its collection of taxes and public debt that can last, is giving vent to this. And that's what's causing this to happen. I can't sort out what his help here is. I think he's despairing. He says a lot of despairing things in this realm. So then, that's one thing, but you're saying then it's happened. And the kind of story that seems to be coming from me is that you've got this, say, problem of justice in the settler colonial state with the indigenous population, and the settler colonial state seems to be getting the advice from Smith, I think if I understood you, of like, manage this conflict or something. You did a bad thing and sort of try to just tell them to wait or something like this, right? I think the only thing I would say about like the resolution of the unjust fact of imperialism to Smith is that it's the way to it is not to reconcile either population, the indigenous or the settler colonial state, to some new and cleansed authority or one or the other variety of authority. That's the source of the problem that got us into this in the first place. So the kind of, he wouldn't say something like, I'm tracking what you were saying, not like, wait and we'll all be reconciled to this power under justice. We can figure out how to mold coercive power such that we'll all be sort of frictionlessly obeying it, injustices will be corrected or something. I think he's saying that way lies danger. That was the source of the problem, and the solution can't be, we got to figure out how to get us to love the state, either one of these groups, anyone at all. So, like, I'm trying to, like, this is a specific thing I'm thinking about, and I can't wrap my mind around what Smith is doing there. I definitely think he fully calls European imperialism fully just. There's no exception for settler colonialism, despite what some people say. He definitely says that, but he identifies the cause of imperialism as this powerful thing. But I don't see him developing a bulwark against that happening again, if you see what I mean. He's sort of saying, oh, I see how this happened. It's unjust, and then I can't find the, yeah, okay, can you help out? What's the, this is what's going on, but how do we stop this thing that I'm calling the fundamental fact of politics? Is he throwing up his hands at it? I don't know exactly. So I hope I came somewhere close there. I just want to describe I think he's saying the cause of imperialism is this thing that I'm talking about, the admiration of the powerful. We want them to have more means to power and then use it every once in a while. Powerful people know to distract us if they're in trouble politically or something. They entertain us with foreign wars. I forget the lines are really striking. But I don't know that he's got a way out other than a way to avoid, which is too much thinking about how to make it such that this one-time settler colonial state is cleaned in some way that everyone can be reconciled it, or that there's some other form that we can do to figure out how we can have practical authority that each of us can assent to or live under. I really think that a strong orientation of his theory is away from that, because I think he thinks it's the source of the problem. So I'd like to talk to you.
We are just about at time. I will not long delay us from the Scottish-themed refreshments. When we adjourn for the refreshments, I'll ask that you go out these doors because the bar service is over there, and if people exit directly into it, then it will create more chaos. But when you go out there, you can bend around. I want to reiterate our gratitude for the excellent partnership and generous support of the Adam Smith Tercentenary program at the University of Glasgow and of the Scottish Government Office. I want to thank the An P. Lynn Centre, of which RGCS is a part, represented here by its director, Catherine Liu, and by Jean-Félix Caron. Come in, Jean-Félix. Who has done really tremendous work organizing this event, assisted in part by Michelle Atkin, doing conference organizational work for RGCS. Unusually, we're also joined by and have the opportunity to in-person thank representatives from the Institute for Liberal Studies, Sabine El-Shabak and Janet Buffton, and the Institute for Liberal Studies supports the ongoing RGCS lecture series, of which this is a part. The subsequent events in the lecture series are listed in the handout, but the next of them will be Kevin Vallier, a philosopher, speaking on the early modern roots of anti-liberalism, October 26th at this same time slot in the Thompson House Ballroom. For the benefit of the Adam Smith Round the World video watchers in the future, I will say I hope that you enjoyed hearing what it is like to read and study Adam Smith here at McGill University, and I hope that everyone will join me in thanking for their excellent work as readers and as explainers of Adam Smith, Shal Marriott and Ryan Griffiths.